The town of Seaside, Maine, was a serene enclave where the rhythm of life was dictated by the ebb and flow of the ocean. Nestled among its rolling hills and picturesque streets was Laura Bennett's home, a charming Victorian house with flower boxes brimming with seasonal blooms. From the outside, everything appeared idyllic. Laura's career as a high school teacher and her well-kept home painted the picture of a perfect life. Yet, behind closed doors, the Bennett household was anything but tranquil. Laura Bennett, although well-respected and admired, was grappling with a gnawing sense of discontent. Her days were consumed by the needs of her students and the expectations of her role as a wife. She had once dreamed of traveling, of pursuing her passion for writing, but those dreams had faded into the background as her life settled into a predictable routine. Her husband, Michael, was a good man, but his relentless work schedule had led to a growing emotional distance between them. Conversations between them had become more functional than intimate, and the spark that once ignited their relationship had long since dimmed. Michael, too, was struggling with his own discontent. His job was demanding and unrewarding, and the long hours he spent away from home only served to widen the gap between him and Laura. He found solace in routine and structure, but felt increasingly disconnected from his wife's emotional needs. The once vibrant connection between them had deteriorated into a series of logistical discussions and perfunctory interactions. Amidst this backdrop of personal dissatisfaction and emotional detachment, Jake Lawson, a student at Laura's school, entered their lives. Jake was a complex figure, rebellious and troubled, but with a deep-seated admiration for Laura. To him, she was a beacon of kindness and understanding in an otherwise chaotic world. Her encouragement and genuine concern stood in stark contrast to the instability he faced at home. Jake's academic performance suffered, but Laura's support provided him with a sense of stability he desperately needed. It was a gray afternoon in late October when the first cracks in the Bennett's facade began to appear. The leaves had turned to shades of amber and gold, and a chill had settled in the air. Laura and Michael were in the midst of a heated argument, their voices rising above the hum of the rain beating against the windows. Jake, who had stayed late after school to work on a project, was passing by the window of Laura's classroom when he overheard their conversation. His heart raced as he listened to the snippets of their argument. The frustration, the accusations, the hurt. Laura and Michael's disagreement was about the growing distance between them. Laura had voiced her frustration over Michael's extended work hours and his emotional withdrawal. Michael, feeling attacked and misunderstood, responded with bitterness and defensiveness. The argument was raw and painful, a glimpse into the private turmoil that had been brewing beneath the surface for months. To Jake, it was a revelation, an insight into the cracks in the Bennett's seemingly perfect life. His initial reaction was a mix of shock and curiosity. The confrontation stirred something deep within him, a feeling of connection with Laura's struggles and a desire to protect her from the turmoil he had witnessed. As the days went by, Jake's obsession with Laura intensified. He began to follow her more closely, his infatuation growing into an unhealthy fixation. He started to monitor her movements, noting her routines and the times when she was alone. His behavior became increasingly erratic, driven by a mix of admiration and a desperate need to be a part of her world. Laura, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the extent of Jake's fixation, though she did notice his increasingly intrusive behavior. The tension in the Bennett household continued to mount. Laura's attempts to address their marital issues with Michael were met with resistance, and her dissatisfaction grew. Michael's suspicions about Laura's fidelity started to take shape as he found a series of anonymous notes and gifts from Jake, which he discovered hidden in Laura's desk drawer. The discovery only added to his growing paranoia and fueled his belief that Laura was involved in an affair. Jake's actions, driven by his unspoken feelings for Laura and his perception of her distress, set the stage for an unfolding tragedy. The seemingly serene life in Seaside was about to be shattered, and the interconnected fates of Laura, Michael, and Jake were poised on the brink of a catastrophic change. As the storm clouds gathered over Seaside, The emotional storms within Laura and Michael's lives brewed with equal intensity. The facade of their perfect life was beginning to crumble, and the consequences of their unresolved conflicts and hidden desires were about to come to a head. The tranquility of their coastal town belied the turbulence that was about to erupt, setting the stage for a series of events that would forever alter their lives. The serene town of Seaside, Maine, had long been a haven of tranquility, but beneath its calm facade, turmoil was brewing. Laura Bennett's life, once marked by its predictable rhythms, was now being disrupted by forces she struggled to control. Her marriage to Michael was fraying at the edges, and Jake Lawson's obsession was escalating into something far more dangerous. Laura's dissatisfaction with her marriage had become a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Michael's extended hours at work had left Laura feeling isolated and neglected, a feeling that grew sharper with each passing day. She tried to fill the void with her work, immersing herself in her students' lives and their problems, but it was a temporary balm. Her interactions with her colleagues and friends seemed increasingly hollow, and the weight of her unspoken frustrations was beginning to affect her demeanor. Jake Lawson's obsession with Laura had taken a dark turn. The fleeting moments of their interactions, where Jake would linger after class or make personal remarks, had developed into an unhealthy fixation. Laura's rebuff of Jake's feelings had not deterred him. Instead, it had intensified his desire to be close to her. Jake began to meticulously track Laura's movements, watching from a distance and noting her habits. His fascination with her had crossed the line from admiration to intrusion, and he started to interfere in ways that went beyond mere observation. One chilly November evening, Laura was alone at the school, grading papers in her classroom. The building was empty except for the occasional creak of settling walls and the distant hum of the heating system. The solitude offered Laura a rare moment of peace, but it was short-lived. She noticed an envelope on her desk, addressed to her but without a return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Laura opened the envelope to find a heartfelt note from Jake. The note expressed admiration and concern for Laura, but it also contained a veiled confession of his feelings. Laura's heart sank as she realized the depth of Jake's obsession. Laura tried to brush off the note as the misguided affections of a troubled student, but the sense of unease lingered. She confronted Jake the next day, expressing her discomfort with the notes and gifts he had been leaving. Jake apologized profusely, claiming that he only wanted to express his gratitude and admiration. He promised it would not happen again, but Laura could sense a flicker of something unsettling in his eyes, a desperation that she could not ignore. Michael's growing suspicions about Laura's fidelity were fueled by his own insecurities and the unsettling evidence he had found. The anonymous gifts and notes from Jake had only heightened his anxiety. He began to monitor Laura more closely, scrutinizing her every move and becoming increasingly irritable and accusatory. Their arguments became more frequent and bitter, filled with accusations and defenses. Michael's paranoia reached a peak when he discovered a second envelope hidden in Laura's desk drawer. This envelope contained a gift, a small locket with a photograph of Jake inside. The discovery was like a match to gasoline. Michael's suspicions exploded into outright hostility. One evening, Michael confronted Laura with the locket, his face red with anger. The argument that followed was a storm of accusations and denials. Laura tried to explain that Jake's behavior was inappropriate, but not indicative of an affair. But Michael's rage was uncontrollable. He stormed out of the house, leaving Laura in tears. That night, Laura could hear the distant rumble of thunder as the storm outside mirrored the tempest within her heart. Jake, meanwhile, was growing more desperate. His fixation on Laura had become all-consuming. He began to show up unannounced, lingering outside her house and school. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He would call her late at night, sometimes hanging up without saying a word. Laura's sense of safety was eroding, and she started to avoid being alone in her house, seeking refuge at her friend's place when she could. The storm of conflicts and tensions reached a crescendo when Michael, overwhelmed by his growing suspicions and anger, began to investigate Jake further. He discovered that Jake had been frequenting local spots where Laura often went, and he realized that Jake was more than just a troubled student. He was a significant presence in Laura's life. This revelation pushed Michael further into a spiral of paranoia and rage. One particularly intense afternoon, after another heated argument with Laura, Michael decided to confront Jake directly. He found Jake loitering outside the school and, in a fit of anger, demanded to know what he was doing. Jake, caught off guard, tried to explain his feelings, but Michael's aggressive approach only escalated the situation. The confrontation was heated, with Jake retreating in fear and Michael's rage simmering beneath the surface. The conflict between Michael and Laura had become a public spectacle. Their arguments were no longer confined to their home. They were overheard by neighbors and discussed in hushed tones among friends. The tension in their household had become palpable, affecting not just their relationship but also the community's perception of them. Laura, feeling trapped and desperate, sought solace in her work and her interactions with her students. But Jake's behavior was becoming harder to ignore. He had started to follow her after school, appearing at her home or in places she frequented. Laura was on edge, her every move feeling scrutinized and controlled. The final catalyst for the unraveling of their lives came one fateful evening. Laura was grading papers in her classroom, trying to focus on the work in front of her despite the growing sense of dread. Michael, consumed by his suspicions, had been watching from a distance. He saw Jake approach Laura's classroom and, driven by a mixture of fear and rage, decided to intervene. Michael's confrontation with Jake that evening was fueled by a mixture of desperation and anger. The two men faced each other in the dimly lit classroom, with Michael accusing Jake of trying to ruin his life. Jake, frightened and defensive, attempted to explain himself, but was overwhelmed by Michael's fury. The encounter escalated quickly, and Michael's rage reached a boiling point. Laura arrived just in time to witness the confrontation. She tried to intervene, but the situation spiraled out of control. The tension in the room was palpable, and the conflict between Michael and Jake reached a peak. In the heat of the moment, a struggle ensued, and the consequences of their actions began to unfold. The facade of Laura and Michael's seemingly perfect life had finally crumbled, and the consequences of their unresolved conflicts and hidden desires were about to erupt in a dramatic and tragic fashion. The stage was set for the devastating events that would follow, forever altering their lives and the lives of those around them. The coastal town of Seaside had never seen such turmoil, and the storm clouds gathering overhead seemed almost prophetic. As the days grew colder and darker, the emotional storm between Laura Bennett, Michael Bennett, and Jake Lawson reached a violent crescendo that would irrevocably change their lives. It was a Friday evening, and the sky was shrouded in heavy, menacing clouds. The first signs of winter had begun to settle in, casting a gray pall over the town. Laura, feeling the weight of the week's events, had decided to stay late at school to grade papers, hoping the solitude would offer her a reprieve from her mounting anxieties. The quiet classroom, with its rows of empty desks and the soft hum of the heater, seemed a refuge from the chaos of her life. Michael had been consumed by his suspicions and anger. The confrontation with Jake earlier that week had only intensified his paranoia. Unable to shake the feeling that his life was unraveling, Michael's thoughts spiraled into a desperate fixation on Laura's alleged infidelity. He felt trapped in a web of betrayal and deceit, and his mind was clouded by a combination of fear and rage. Jake, for his part, was increasingly unstable. His obsession with Laura had taken over his life, driving him to acts of intrusion and manipulation. His behavior had become erratic, and he had started to show up unannounced at Laura's home and at her workplace. His fixation had driven him to a breaking point, and he was desperate for any connection to Laura, even if it meant crossing dangerous lines. That evening, the confrontation began when Michael, driven by a mixture of jealousy and desperation, decided to confront Jake one final time. His suspicion that Jake was the source of all his marital troubles and dissatisfaction had reached its zenith. Michael had spent the day following Jake, watching his movements with growing unease. When Jake was spotted lingering around the school, Michael saw it as the perfect opportunity to confront him. Laura had just settled into her routine, grading papers and trying to ignore the chaos that loomed over her life. The steady rhythm of her pen against the paper was interrupted by a knock on the classroom door. She opened it to find Michael standing there, his face pale and eyes wild with a mix of anger and determination. "What are you doing here, Michael?" Laura asked, her voice tinged with both surprise and concern. "I need to talk to you now," Michael demanded, pushing past Laura into the classroom. Laura watched in confusion as Michael paced the room, his anger palpable. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to calm him down. Michael's gaze was fixed on the doorway as he spoke. "I've seen him around town, Laura. I've seen him follow you, and I'm done with this. Need to confront him." Before Laura could respond, the door to the classroom opened again, and Jake entered. He had been lurking outside, trying to gather his courage. The sight of Michael's angry face and Laura's troubled expression only fueled his anxiety. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Michael turned to face Jake, his face a mask of fury. "You think you can just waltz into our lives and take whatever you want?" he shouted, stepping closer to Jake. "You think you can play games with my wife?" Jake recoiled, his eyes wide with fear. "I didn't mean to." "I don't want to hear your excuses," Michael interrupted, his voice echoing through the empty classroom. "You've already caused enough damage." The confrontation quickly escalated. Michael's accusations and Jake's defensive pleas became a cacophony of noise. Laura tried to intervene, but her attempts were futile against the raw intensity of the men's emotions. The tension in the room was palpable, and the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. In the midst of the chaos, Michael's frustration and rage reached a boiling point. His anger was no longer directed solely at Jake, but also at Laura. He felt betrayed on all fronts and could no longer contain his emotions. As Michael's outbursts became more frenzied, Jake, feeling cornered and desperate, grabbed a letter opener from Laura's desk. The letter opener, a small and seemingly innocuous object, became the focal point of the struggle. Jake's fear and adrenaline drove him to act impulsively. In the heat of the moment, the letter opener was used in a frenzied and violent manner. Michael was caught off guard, and the confrontation turned into a physical struggle. Laura screamed in terror as the struggle between Michael and Jake reached its peak. The classroom was a scene of chaos, with papers flying and furniture being overturned. In the midst of the struggle, Michael was injured, and the severity of his wounds quickly became apparent. As the violence subsided, Jake, terrified and panicked, fled the scene. Laura, in shock and horror, rushed to Michael's side. The sight of her husband bleeding and unconscious was a nightmare come to life. Laura's mind raced as she tried to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. She called 911, her hands trembling as she spoke to the dispatcher. The emergency response was swift, but it was clear that Michael's injuries were severe. Laura's attempts to comfort Michael were in vain. His condition worsened rapidly, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. In the aftermath of the incident, Laura was left to grapple with the consequences of the night's events. The police investigation began immediately, with officers interviewing Laura and reviewing the evidence from the classroom. Jake, meanwhile, had gone into hiding, trying to evade the law and dealing with his own overwhelming guilt and fear. The investigation revealed the full extent of the events that had transpired. Laura's account of the confrontation was scrutinized, and the inconsistencies in her story raised suspicions. The discovery of the letter opener and the forensic evidence painted a grim picture of the struggle that had taken place. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The details of the confrontation were laid bare, and the court proceedings were filled with emotional testimony from those involved. Laura's grief was palpable, and Jake's unstable behavior was a focal point of the prosecution's case. In the end, Jake was found guilty of manslaughter. His actions, driven by fear and obsession, had led to the tragic death of Michael Bennett. Laura's role in the incident was scrutinized, and while she was not charged with any crime, her involvement in the events was a subject of public debate and scrutiny. Laura's life was forever altered by the events of that night. The town of Seaside, once a haven of peace, was now marked by the scars of the tragedy. Laura struggled to find a semblance of normalcy in the aftermath of the trial, grappling with her own feelings of guilt, loss, and the shattered remnants of her marriage. Jake Lawson, having served his sentence, was left to rebuild his life in the wake of his actions. The town of Seaside, and the people who lived there, were left to reconcile with the profound impact of the tragic events that had unfolded. The echoes of that fateful night lingered long after the courtroom doors had closed, a reminder of the fragile nature of life and the devastating consequences of unresolved conflicts and hidden desires.